name is Eric Marks. I'm on the MPSC Board of Directors. First, some MPSC announcements. The winter edition of our magazine, MPSC Wavelength, is in members' mailboxes and is now online. There's lots of great content in this new issue, and you can read the full magazine at mpsc.org. At the MPSC store, you'll find all sorts of apparel as well as mugs, water bottles, stationery, tote bags, and more. Head to mpsc.org/store to see which clothes and accessories suit your style. On our MPSC YouTube channel, you'll find lots of great sound advice events from the past few years. Head there to learn more from the sound teams behind Better Call Saul, Mr. Robot, Metal Gear Solid, Halo Infinite, Back to the Future, and more. And perhaps most importantly, our 70th annual MPSC Golden Reel Awards are next month. They're going to be on February 26th. For more news about this event, please stay tuned on our website at mpsc.org. And thank you everyone for coming to tonight's very special MPSC Sound Advice event. Over the past 40 years, no film producer has had a greater impact on action movies than legendary producer Jerry Bruckheimer. Decades before comic book movies dominated the box office, iconic films of the 1980s, such as Beverly Hills Cop, Top Gun, and Days of Thunder helped make his work synonymous with outsized action and bombastic fun. The films only got bigger and more exciting in the 1990s and beyond. According to a Variety quote, the Bruckheimer touch is characterized by a consistently edgy, high-octane visual dynamic and equally distinctive storytelling driven by the triumphalism so popular with Madison Avenue. When the lights dimmed in a movie theater and that Jerry Bruckheimer film's logo with the lightning strike played, you knew you were about to be pinned to the back of your seat for 2+ hours. At next month's 70th annual MPSC Golden Reel Awards, we'll be honoring Jerry with the prestigious Filmmaker Award. His impact is widespread. I imagine every one of us can remember seeing a Bruckheimer film and laughing, cheering, and being able to cherish that experience for a lifetime. Tonight, let's begin reflecting on Jerry's impact on the world of cinema together. I'm honored to be joined by 5 incredible sound artists who have helped bring a number of Bruckheimer films to life since the 1980s and 90s. Here to talk about it all with us tonight are supervising dialogue editor, Terry Dorman, sound editors Midge Costin, Suhail Cafferty, and F. Hudson Miller, and Foley artist Dan O'Connell. So I want to start tonight by rewinding the tape about 30 years. Each of you get a call to work on the next Jerry Bruckheimer film. What's the first thing that goes through your mind?
Oh my God, we'll never get it done.
By the way, just for the record, Hudson cut that lightning maybe 2 or 3 times in the various stages of, as it morphed in and out of the various films. That was Hudson that did that.
That's sort of like having the history of doing the rifleman's shotgun.
Exactly. Yeah,
it kept getting bigger and more theatrical with every version.
My very first experience with Bruckheimer, I did Flashdance with them, and I was an assistant sound editor at the time, and it was my first real big experience of working on a major motion picture, and the way that movie was moving, and how fast the editing was, and how fast the changes would come in, and all that on this little dance movie was just incredible. And from that point on, it was whenever I came onto a Bruckheimer movie as an editor, it was always just like Hudson said, oh my God, we're never going to get this thing done because it's just a lot of work. But that's
it's
that's the experience with him.
But you start it and you take the first foot of the film, you put it in that time in the moviola, and you start, and then somehow about 6 months later you finish.
Well, the idea too is you know that a Bruckheimer movie is coming up, and you clear your calendar. I'm not going to be available ever again here.
No weddings, no funerals, no luncheons, no vacations.
No life. Yeah.
And what I remember too is that everyone, you wouldn't get, and I think this happens a lot of times for everybody, that you'd get sick at the end of the show, but we'd all be like, we'd make it through somehow. And
And everybody would be a crash and burn afterwards.
yeah, oh my God, it would be so crazy. I didn't even know what was wrong with me. And then and people would go, Midge, you're exhausted. And it was like, oh,
Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah. Oh, Jerry Bruckheimer film. We started the first day of the film The Rock. I had done earlier in my career, I had done Flashdance as well, and Beverly Hills Cop and a few other things. But the first day of The Rock as Foley artist coming in, and we, you know, Victoria Martin was our supervisor on it. She was fabulous, and she calls me about 10 o'clock and says, "Okay, this is what's going to happen. They want you to work 7 days a week, 9 to midnight for the next 6 weeks." And we were just thinking we were coming in to do a regular gig, you know, like our 9 to 5 Foley or whatever. And we all looked at each other and went like, okay, let's see how this goes. Let's see if this works. So we did, and we had a thing called, it was like the Navy SEALs. If you couldn't make it, you rang the bell. And somebody would just like, because we would just get to the point where somebody would just get exhausted and drop. And then we'd have to switch into their place and stuff like that. But in the long run, it was well worth it. But those hours out of the gate were kind of a trip to do.
And you had
Wow.
you had huge amounts of time for the Foley on those shows, didn't you? Compared
Yes.
to what you do now.
So that's big difference between what we have now and we had then. We had great, George was really fabulous. George Waters was fabulous about putting great budgets together. And we had full crews, as you guys well know. We had a pretty good group of people. Yeah, that was fantastic because they had the time, and we were able to bill for it. We were able to do the whole overtime and the weekends and the whole thing. And it was because that's what Michael wanted to do. And they knew they had a good product on their hand.
And that was one of the great things about the Jerry Bruckheimer films is they were hard. I mean, they were really hard. They were the hardest stuff I did over my career, or probably any of our careers. But George was able to always work it out with Jerry, so there was the money for the personnel and the overtime required to get the job done. It was exhausting, and you wish there'd been 2 more months to spread it out in. But But George was good at getting the resources, and Jerry always came through with the resources, which is not, I can't say about all the other projects I worked on. Sometimes they just get beaten into the ground with no resources, but there were always resources with Jerry.
yeah. And you knew that it was going to be that sound mattered in telling the story. And I mean, that's a lot of times what the films are up for Academy Awards and stuff, and George Waters, who was, supervised so many of the shows until he retired, right? He was great. But it was always, you knew that it was that sound mattered. So that was the kind of the fun part about it. And then all of us working together was a fun part. But there was a lot of insanity. Like I remember like my first union show, thank you, Hudson, was Days of Thunder.
Oh my God, you went to the deep end.
That was so crazy. I know. And I'll just never forget it. But I remember a Sunday night, like thinking, like, how do you get off the show? It was like, and we were on quadruple time or whatever. It was so crazy. And at one point you think it's just not, what is this worth it? I'm gonna
Well, what you do is you at least for me, what I found out was that my first few weeks of the film, I was always fighting the movie. I mean, I was trying to keep my life in perspective to the movie and try to maintain some sense of balance. And after about 2 weeks, you surrender. There's this big fight. There's this big fight going on inside you about it. And then as the overtime starts to pile up and you start to go into 7 days, there's one just horrible week while you get used to it. And then you just surrender yourself for the next umpteen months.
Well, the thing is with Jerry's movies is that they were always very challenging and on complete perspective of the soundtrack, from dialogue to sound effects and music. They were always very, very challenging. And the thing with Jerry's movies is that he expected a really good soundtrack. It wasn't like, just cut whatever you want. No, he really wanted a good soundtrack. And George and the rest of us always came through and delivered for that. But it was not something that that was just nonchalant. He was very, very specific about his soundtracks. He'd come to the dub stage and he'd ask for things that you normally wouldn't hear a producer ask for. It was like in Armageddon, for example, when the shuttle was flying around, he says, I want this thing to move around the room. I want people to feel it move. And it's like, you don't hear producers ever say that. They just don't know.
Usually it's just raise the
He knew, and then you make it happen. So I want that line to be clear. I want to hear that line.
Yeah, he had a keen sense of sound, and my brother Kevin mixed a lot of those projects, and he would always call me, at the end of like a session, and he would tell me how Jerry wanted to, he was very specific about how he wanted to do things and how he wanted to he really participated in the soundtrack. And I think that's kind of a trickle down thing. We all get excited in our jobs when we know the director is excited about the job as well, and I think I've noticed that over the years, it's just, you get a director that is making comments about stuff here and there on the stage, and you're going, okay, cool, they're digging it. Let's do something even cooler. Let's blow their minds a little bit more. So that was really neat about Jerry, entirely through every mix that I ever heard that he was on. It was great.
The world was a different place. The world that we started when we were in film, the crews were larger.
Yeah.
We're right now we're talking the five of us, we're talking about a whole floor of people that it would take to do a Jerry Bruckheimer movie.
On Days of Thunder, we had 63 people.
The amount of people that George had compiled, it wasn't just that he was good at doing the budgets. He had a way of handpicking the people that he knew would deliver. And at the time when it was film, it was take a reel, do a reel. It was everybody hands-on, and they would have the responsibility of, at the time, the 10 minutes of film that were on a reel. And there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of crosstalk, a lot of coordinating amongst editors. How did you reel end? How did it begin? That there was the same pattern of sound effects. George had his hands on all of that. He would literally handwrite his cue sheets of how he wanted this project, this film, this reel, this situation in this scene to sound. And multiple spotting sessions and multiple times we would all get together to try and figure out, how this was going to lay out, from the beginning into the dub stage. And then, like I said, I started on Beverly Hills Cop. I went into Top Gun. Those were all film movies. And not until it switched to the digital world did things sort of break off and get specialized. That's when dialogue went its own way and ADR went its own way. And there was less, not that there was less collaboration or less of teamwork, but there were departments at that time.
There's more specialization.
It was a different way of dealing with it. So working on a Jerry Bruckheimer film in the early days, in the 80s, was quite different than later on. And the Pirates movies, things could be spread all over from different locations. I mean, a lot of editors that were up north, and there were a lot of editors that were here, but we were able to blend it, communicate digitally. So it's two different worlds.
In the beginning, we all cut. We didn't just cut one thing. We all cut dialogue. We all cut sound effects. We all cut backgrounds. It wasn't until Pro Tools started to invade our lives that we really started to separate it up. As Terry was saying, it became much more specialized at that point. Interestingly enough, George's crew was probably one of the last crews to go from film to digital, and we did a couple small movies, and sort of warming up to it. But then we jumped whole hog with Armageddon as our first real digital show. So we went from film to Armageddon in like 2 steps, and it was a little frightening at the beginning, but if you're gonna learn, you might as well learn on the job.
Yeah, we
That's a
still
pretty
had a
big one.
big crew because there was still a pretty big crew, I think, and we did split more who was cutting effects, who was cutting dialogue and all that. But I loved cutting, like, I think probably my favorite Bruckheimer film was, and one of my favorite films that I worked on was Crimson Tide. And it was great when you cut both dialogue and effects because you really knew the real, you know, you really knew you felt like you just really knew the real, and it was really fun to do it that way. And then you know, and then we just started to kind of break off and just do, but something when it was crazy, like Days of Thunder was so crazy because you said we had 63 people, and what I remember what we had was they were writing the movie, they had to shoot a different ending. Remember that they did it on the Paramount lot. They brought Robert Townsend in to finish, you know, try to help with the ending. And we were madly, you know, working. And literally it came down to, I remember effects wise, I always had the bad guy's car, whoever was racing against Tom Cruise. I had his engine and I had the aerial kind of shots of the things going around. And I remember Ed Callahan just had all the skids. So I think it's when he lost his hair. But all he was cutting was skids.
All I was cutting was buys.
Right, with the right
With a whoosh over the top of them.
yeah,
Making
right.
the car move.
It was so crazy.
Wow.
Um,
I had a couple of questions. I want to start with The Rock. So there's so many jaw-dropping action scenes in this film. I wanted to ask about the car chase through
Go
San
ahead.
Francisco. So,
Okay,
Sean
go
Connery's
ahead.
character, yeah, Sean Connery's character is, you know, he's trying to escape via a military-sized Hummer. He's followed by the police and also Nicolas Cage's character in a brand new Ferrari. You all are working on this in 1996. What sorts of challenges did this chase scene present for you all, and how did you go about bringing it to life?
Well, since I cut it, I probably should answer it. The first instruction we had from Mr. Bay was I want to have absolutely the authentic engine in this car. So we sent out a recordist who did a whole series of recordings of this car. And unfortunately, it was a brand new car, a brand new production car. And the God honest truth, it just didn't sound like much of anything. I mean, it sounded like a modern, big revving car, but it had no character whatsoever. It was just a generic sounding fast car. So I went back in the library, dug around, and found a Ferrari that was probably 15 years older, and just dumped the whole new recordings because they just didn't work, and cut the whole thing out of this old car. And when Michael asked, "Is that the real thing?" we said, "Yep, that's the real thing."
Amazing.
So it's all about so to a certain degree, our job is salesmanship as well.
Wow. And how about the Hummer and the police?
The Hummer was all new recordings of an H1.
That's great. I mean, and it's such a dynamic sequence too. They're you know, coming around turns, they're flying off hills because it's San Francisco. There's the trolley at the end. I'm curious just how
Revs are your friend. Revs will fix all problems. Revs and skids will solve all problems.
Wow.
And as far as Foley goes, we were just like doing like the sweetening the impacts and sweetening the suspension and things like that. And then the cable car at the end was a whole scenario with the wheels screeching down, you know, down the street and then blowing up into flames. And we have a great picture of that actually. That may be on our website, I'm not sure, but of us, you know, trying to create that sound of the high pitched cable car wheels. And I'm sure effects cut it as well.
Yeah, I listened to your stuff and I worked against your stuff. Victoria played it for me, and I cut additional stuff to go with it to thicken it up in places, but it was great.
Yeah, it all sounded really cool together. It was a really nice ending to that whole thing.
People think that effect, that shot of the cable car going up is a visual effect or a miniature. No, it's a practical. They
Yeah.
said they took a car and they sent it up. That's a bunch of explosions launching that thing into the air.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, no, and I
True
have
practical effect. And and the truth be told, it's silly and over the top and crazy, but the fact that it's the real deal
yeah,
plays so much better than if it was a visual effect. Somehow, no matter how great the visual effects are, there's some part of some visceral experience of seeing the real thing go down that there's nothing like it. And
yeah.
that was the real deal.
And that was a beautiful shot. As I said, I have that shot somewhere, and it's like I look at it and I go, wow, the beautiful colors of the flames and whatever they used to blow it all up, and just fantastic shot.
So like this action scene, I think it's a good example of just the era of action films, Michael Bay, Jerry Bruckheimer types of films that you all are working on. The pace of the editing in these action sequences is just, for its time, it's so thrilling and unique and ahead of its time, I think, in terms of just the pace. There are a ton of shot changes, especially compared to just the way other action films were edited of the era. I'm just curious how that affected your workflow, and the overall post schedule when you're working on these sorts of action films compared to others.
I can tell you from my perspective, when I first saw the sequence, I just said, my response was, they're going to be throwing up in the front row of the Cinerama Dome when they see this. Because it's like, bam, 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 bam. And so what becomes difficult for a sound effects editor in a situation like that is how to resolve things quickly enough to be able to get to the next thing. We sort of had a stylistic methodology with the Bruckheimer films in terms of the effects. And that was that the films had a lot of detail, a lot of impact and power, but we tended to hit the sound effect hard on the first few frames and then get out of it as fast as possible to give it over to dialogue or music, and also to clear enough space for us to bring the next impact in. So we were doing a lot of, and this is Greg Russell, who mixed most of these, we're doing a lot of hit it hard, get out, hit it hard, get out.
Yeah,
So that stylistically, that affected the mix a lot.
The other thing about it, though, is when you had an action scene like that, you knew it was going to change. And the massive number of changes that would come in at a later date. So that was something to conquer. But whether you were dealing with a Michael Bay film or whether you were dealing with a Tony Scott film, it was still the same kind of frenetic editing and the same kind of action-packed situation. That didn't exclude dialogue, though, because there was always dialogue and dialogue scenes that you'd have to balance against those effects. And it was similar in format and yet different in style. Tony Scott's was faster cuts and Michael Bay's was explosive. So you sort of had to get used to that. But when you knew you were going into that kind of film, you adjusted to that style, or you adjusted to that kind of editing and the process that we all add.
And I'm sure Jerry can talk to this a little more than I can, but Jerry had a very specific style in terms of his dialogue too. We used to joke, because it was true, we put all the dialogue 10 feet in front of the screen. Now this is a very unnatural sounding sound to a movie, dialogue to a movie, because it's really up in your face. But give about 10 minutes into the movie, the audience, it's an artificial construct. A movie is an artificial construct. So within 10 minutes, the audience has bought into it and doesn't notice it. But what they do is they're able to get all the dialogue. You don't ever in a Jerry Bruckheimer film turn to your wife or your husband and say, "What'd he say? What'd he say?" That never happens, because the dialogue is right there and it's right up at the same level with the effects, so that the dialogue is not suffering because of the music or effects. Everything is dodging and diving, but the dialogue is right up there.
Because Jerry always paid attention to what the audience was hearing. So on the dub stage, when he had a playback, you could count on his exact footages where he couldn't pick up the words, because it was important to him not to have that happen in an audience, for somebody to turn to someone else and say, "What did he say?" So that was always forefront. So the mix, the balance of the mix was important. So that it wasn't as if you were hearing the effects go away. It just was a gradual thing, and you never missed a word.
Yeah.
So it was,
I remember, yeah, and I remember like learning on the job that idea of what Hudson was talking about, that you had to get out of things fast, especially if there was a gunfight. You know, you had to like, you know, and you had to, you know, you had to figure out where the guns were all coming from and everything. But it's just so that it wasn't a big old mess, you know, whether it was cars or guns or whatever, that it wasn't just a big old, you know, that you had to figure that out, and you had to like wipe out, especially when we were literally wiping out the tracks. You know, that. And the other thing I have to say about Jerry Bruckheimer is I remember just his notes. Like, okay, every year, remember this, you guys, he would go to the Kentucky Derby and we'd have to wait for his notes over that weekend. But the thing about him,
And it was just, and the film was coming out usually
I know,
on
right? And it was-
Labor
it was
Day,
just-
so it's, or Memorial Day, so
Memorial
it's only
Day,
this
yeah.
far apart.
Right. And so we'd be waiting for his notes. But I have to say, the thing about it is that he had good story notes. Like, I thought his notes were really good. And you can't say that about everybody. Like, I think there's some producers who I think are filmmakers, and some producers who are producers in name or whatever, but they're not overall filmmakers. But he was just such a filmmaker. And also, it seemed like, I mean, like he picked up Michael Bay and a few other people. He'd pick up these directors who had strong visuals and, you know, visual storytelling. And then if they made it like Michael Bay, you know, then they, you know, you know, they became hit in his, you know, great directors or whatever. But, and so, but I don't think that in the first film that they'd have, you know, he would always have, I don't think that the directors would get final cuts, but eventually, you know, they'd earn that. And it was, but Jerry.
Only one guy had final cut, and that was Jerry Bruckheimer.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And he was just like, he's a good storyteller. He's a good filmmaker overall. And, you know, it's nice to see him getting the Filmmakers Award, even though, you know, I personally don't care for the films that we were working on. They were fun to do for sound. It's not,
You're going to be a sound effects editor. It doesn't get much better than that.
If you want to cut sound effects, it's you're on a Jerry project, period.
That's
all
that's,
it
Well-
that's
well-
called the bread and butter.
Well, they were all fun for Foley. You know, we got to like, and then The Rock, we, you know, they spent a lot of time in the water. We were in the water a lot of the time. Stuff Foley stuff is always kind of fun for those films, because there's gear and there's guns and there's water and there's the bad guys and the good guys, and you have to kind of make sure they all sound kind of, you know, different. And we were very fortunate to, our stage at the time had this really long water pit that we could actually get in and walk around and create all those under the rock scenes, which came out really nicely. But they were always kind of fun for us. Like Con Air is another one that was just fun for us as Foley guys, you know, because
Like that's like the quintessential Jerry Bruckheimer movie.
Yeah, exactly. We're running around an airplane, chaining with chains and, you know, handcuffs and going crazy. So, so that aspect for us was a blast. Of course.
The cool thing about the Foley, you know, it's like it's not to diminish the stuff that I did on these films, but I always loved it at the end of one of these films to do an M&E, to strip all my work, Pac-Man, everything, and just play the Foley. Because I remember that I used to call Victoria and tell her to tell you guys, the stuff sounds great. It plays amazing.
Always sounded great.
How cool.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you know, they are perfect projects for what we do, and perfect projects to have fun with. Another one just came to mind was the National Treasure.
Oh yeah.
Series, which was so much fun, all the different going through
Gadget
books.
City.
Yeah, I still have what we used for the Declaration of Independence, and rolled up in a thing and props like that on the stage. But thank you for that compliment. That's great that you guys
We always appreciate it.
that at the end of a show. That's cool.
What are the,
Yeah.
Victoria, I would call Victoria and say it was perfect. It was great.
One of the great things about these shows too was, unlike a lot of other films I've worked on, we had a relatively huge budget for original material, for original recordings, for design, and 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 time to invent and create. Now everything is you're expected to rip it out of the Pro Tools like it's some kind of magic machine, whereas we had weeks and months of recordings that we did that allowed you to listen to them, to play with them, because an awful lot of what we do is what we call creativity is play. Is we play with it, manipulate it, we find out where the answers live, and that can only really come about with spending time with something. And now, unfortunately, so many of these projects are being pushed out the door so fast that the sound editors and mixers are just not given the respect and time to delve in and find the magic. They're forced to sort of pull it out of their ears, out of a Pro Tools, whereas we had the opportunity of having to get original recordings. If they didn't work, we got different recordings, and we found the answers in the work instead of having to inflict what we wanted on the work.
That's a great point.
Different times again. Different
Well,
times.
the
Different times.
budgets were fabulous for those projects. I mean, honestly, when I compare them to what we have to do now on some of these things, it shocks me that it's even doable. But we just have to, in our world, we just have to rely on the fact that we've been doing it a long time, and we just got to go out of the gate and just go bam. And it's not like there's the days of getting to work overtime and weekends on a show are long gone. So at least for Foley artists.
Yeah, I was going to say about the overtime. I mean, you take a film like Coyote Ugly. I literally remember working 36 hours straight because we had a deadline, and we had a deadline. You had to meet that deadline, so there was no stopping it. So it was out of control amounts of time. It almost felt like, the budget, the dam broke through, and we had to get to that date. So it was by the time we were on a dub stage, when we had an end date and had to meet it, that you start working 36 hours straight. And that's when they brought in the trailers, and they,
that's right.
Lost it. The same thing happened on the Pirate series. We had a deadline. It was massive. They were long pictures. And, we were working into wee hours of the morning. Normally we would do a Bruckheimer movie. We were at Disney and we were mixing at Sony. So there was that factor. There was a whole crew of people, buildings worth of people that were at Disney while dubbing was going on at Sony.
And it wasn't like now where you can just push a button and it moves. Somebody had to take all that stuff and put it in boxes and carry it across town.
Totally. You're right.
One of the most interesting memories I have of Jerry and the movie making process, and we've touched on it a little bit about the money. What Terry was just talking about, how the dub stage things would suddenly get crazy. I remember we used to have. We don't have them anymore in the same way. We used to have what we call lab deadlines, and that because the film all had to be printed. So if we're going to make 4,000 copies of this thing at the laboratories, they had to have weeks. They had weeks prep time to get it ready. Also, you had to get in line with Jaws and Empire Strikes Back and all the other films. There was a very distinct schedule that the lab was going to be available to print your material. So we would have these lab deadlines, and usually we wouldn't get the whole picture finished and send to the lab. We would send one reel, it would go to the lab. The next reel, it would go to the lab, and they would start printing while we were still working on the later reels. But I remember one was the last reel. I think it must have been Armageddon. It was Armageddon was like 2:00 in the morning, and we were trying to get the last reel, which was probably like reel 12 or something,
Something like that.
out the door, and then we were mixing 8 o'clock. The lab deadline was 8 o'clock, and George turns to Jerry and says, "Jerry, we're at lab deadline." And he says, "George, it's okay. And then 10 o'clock comes by. "Jerry, we're 2 hours past lab deadline." And the runner's in the lobby. The lab is calling me. I said, okay, George. At 2:00 in the morning, George says, we are now 6 hours past lab deadline. And Jerry's getting a little, not annoyed, but just, he wants to put a stop to this. He turns to George and says, George, it's only money. I went, oh,
Well,
I
on
get
that-
it. Finally, I figured it out. It's only money.
You know, on that reel, I was there till 4 a.m. and we had gotten a last minute optical on one of the asteroids. And I had to cut a new effect for it. And that was it. It was like, that was the end of it. And, you know, Greg and Kevin, you know, mixed that last bit and mastered it. And that was the end of it. But it wasn't until almost 4 a.m. that we actually finished that.
So the
up.
runner was in there in overtime for like 10 hours.
That's
Well,
the
We
scenario.
we were in overtime on that show, the end of it. We did a 3-day run. We actually slept at Sony in the trailer. So no, it was great.
And that's how it was for all of the end of his big movies.
Well, it
I want to
seems
come back
like-
to Armageddon in a few minutes. I did want to jump to Con Air with a couple questions about that film. I think one thing that people forget about a lot of these films is just how funny they are. You know, how many jokes there are, and that they don't always take themselves 100% seriously. Yeah, I wasn't there till 4
Yeah,
a.m.
put the bunny down. Put the bunny down.
That was good.
That's true.
Put the bunny down.
So there's like all this chaos happening, and then you've got things like that. You've got, you know, Dave Chappelle's character is sliding in with all these great jokes amidst
Right.
this chaos. You know, who could have thought where his career would have gone from that point?
Yeah.
Terry, how big of a challenge is it for you to preserve all this great dialogue and banter? Some of it seems ad-libbed when there's these just bombastic sequences happening.
Some of it is ad lib, but you know, in that case, a lot of it was in the script. I mean, that there was something in that movie that was sort of taking something so serious, like lightheartedly, and it was Con Air was a challenge. It was another one that was crazy hours. You know, a lot of people were on that film at the time. It was film. It was not digital. I just remember the number of hours trying to get that out there, and the characters, the amount of ADR that was mixed in between. Juno Ellis did most of the ADR on the early films and most of the films with George. So we sort of had a back and forth balance of, you know, what was going to be ADR, what was going to be production, how to build out the crowds, how to accomplish all that. And that came up in multiple films that we had, you know. It seemed to change a little when we entered into a digital world. That was almost more controllable than the film. You know, there were some of the early films I had 6 dialogue editors. That never happens today. Absolutely never happens today. Whether it was Pirates, whether it was Pearl Harbor, if the film was longer, we needed that many people it was like a machine. You know, you'd split it up 2, and 2, and you had to have that number of people with the number of changes, the number of reels, and the deadlines. So
We get changes of 400 changes per reel on
Yeah.
a weekly basis.
Yeah, it was a bummer when that would happen though, and it would be because we started to do temps like really well because we'd just be building on the temp, right? Building on the temp, and because you would just know that you were just going to spend a lot of time doing changes, you know, and it would cut down the kind of creative time or something, what you were talking about earlier, Hudson. I just noticed in the chat that Karen Spangenberg, who should be here with us,
Karen!
Hey, Karen.
she must have been on that reel because she said it was "No one move or the bunny gets it." Karen got that reel. That was a fun, crazy show.
that was Karen's reel. There you go.
Wow.
I mean,
I had a only
Hudson and
question
I
actually.
Hudson and I spent a full week because that Con Air was cut on film, and Hudson and I spent a full week changing one reel.
Yeah, so it's the reel with the
The canisters exploding and
the the car going through the fire truck in the tunnel.
Right.
at the end of the film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We spent a full week just changing units and
Wow.
pre-dubs. But when that would never
Um,
happen today. You have half a day to get that done now.
A Foley question for you, Dan.
Yes.
So, early in the film, there's this great scene where we're sort of introduced to each of the prisoners as they come off a bus.
That's right.
And they're introduced by John Cusack over this sort of voiceover. It's almost like a boxing match where we're introduced to all the characteristics of each character. And right away, we see that these characters have these really big, long shackles attached to all their limbs,
Mhm.
which were pretty important to the film. And obviously, given that this is sort of a prison breakout film, how did you go about covering these in the film?
Well, actually, and it's funny, we still have those shackles. We use them for other things. And we had a really cool prop guy at the time that would find us these things. And so we got a really long chain of shackles, and we would, each character, of course, has their own pace and their own character. So we would try and make sure that the shackle that they were wearing also went along with their character at the time. So that was, and we wanted to make it sound a little different, so it wasn't just one long chain sounding thing. And it's a fun introduction because you get to meet everybody along the way. Cyrus the Virus, and Steve Buscemi comes up later, I guess. But yeah, we still have all those shackles, and we took pieces of each one and recorded it differently for each character so that they all had a little bit of a different quality. I think that's what made it a little more exciting to just have the character come through the chain sound as well.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I think you could argue that one of the main characters in this film is the plane itself.
Absolutely.
Which, John Malkovich aptly introduces to us as Con Air in the film. How do all of you build out the sounds of the plane itself in this film?
Well, first of all, we have. Go ahead.
That is a really interesting story because RJ, I think, did the plane, right? But the director didn't like the plane. Remember that? And he would change it over and over. Here it is, the whole throughout, like half the movie, they're on the plane, right? And he just didn't like the steady on the plane. He didn't like the plane engine.
Yeah, we had gone out and actually recorded. We actually sent John Fasal out to actually record a C-123 through a couple days of recording in the back with the back end open, doing live recordings. You couldn't have gotten me on the back of that airplane for love nor money. Send him.
John ended up recording the plane as well as the helicopters that were
So those were all original recordings.
good recordings.
And then
we sweetened everything, that the plane did. Every time it would move and whatever, it would be, we'd accented it. And then the interior of that aircraft, we actually added, almost like a train boxcar, rattles and movements and things like that to really give it a little more character than what it really was. And then it was sold.
It's pretty because in reality it's just. But that is that's wonderful, but it ain't Santa-matic. So
But what about the
so we
plane
just
crash
trashed
into
it up.
Vegas? Plane crash into Vegas with the spin-off engine.
Yeah. That was one of my pieces of trouble. That was a handful.
Yeah, it was a handful for crowds too.
Yeah, it was just, but it was well put together so that you were able they gave the sound effects enough room to pay things off. For instance, when the scene finally comes to a stop, it goes in the casino and it hits a jackpot on a slot machine, and it all pays off, and the whole room goes quiet. So the mixers brought it all down quiet, so the machine can pay off the joke. But and those films, though they were crazy, they weren't just frenetic for frenetic's sake. The action was designed to be able to play the gags, to be able to play the action, to play the dialogue. I mean, it's a remarkably complicated kind of film to make, visually as well as sonically.
Yeah,
There's-
that's the reel that I had was the one where they take off in the desert and they have the big chain and then it catches the guy's Corvette and it pulls out of the thing and then it hits the tower, the whatever prison thing.
Mhm.
And and it was like the joke, and then if this is any other thing, this would be I forget what the line was. This would seem crazy. There's a Corvette flying behind and the plane, this C-130, and then it crashes, oh my God, it was insane. It was so crazy, but there was, it was about character. And then he's
Yeah, and it does set the tone for the movie. The audience is going to know right away what kind of movie this is going to be, which was great.
It's a comic action picture.
Comic action, yeah.
Yeah, and I love that, Hudson, you said it's a quintessential Bruckheimer film too.
Yeah, I think
Con
that's
Air.
if you asked me for one film that would define the Jerry Bruckheimer all body of work, it would be Con Air. It's got like every piece of every other movie in it.
Inside the plane, that like early on we see like the most dangerous prisoners are put into these like almost cages.
The
in
cages, yeah.
plane, with these motorized sliding doors, and the characters, sometimes they're banging on the cages. I was curious how you all, I don't know if this is Dan or some combination of you all, how you approach those sounds.
It's always
we
a combination.
Yeah, it was definitely probably a combination, but with us, I think that the effects editors and the Foley people kind of like did a lot of stuff that worked well together. And we set up, set up on our stage those type of cages, and we could actually like rattle them and smash them, and we had the chains against them, and you could throw the bodies against them and really kind of make a cool sound. And also it helped with the you were talking about the interior of the airplane rattle. We would move those as well on the shots where they were in the scene. So it was really kind of, and it's another dimension, it's another sound other than the low end of the plane and the rattles and stuff, and all of a sudden you've got this high kind of chain link sound happening, which I thought really added to the whole soundscape.
I think also what helped was a little bit of our working methodology too. Before we were on digital, when we were still on film, whenever possible, the editor who's doing the reel would go to the Foley stage for a playback of what the material before it was cut, which was going to sound like, so that we had, even it was only one hearing, you got really good at memorizing what you just heard and going back to your cutting room and changing or manipulating what you were doing so that it would fit in like a pocket with what they had done. That's one of the great things about having an analog background, is that we weren't able to listen to multiple things. You could play one or two effects at the most at a time. So you had to learn to have a fabulous sonic memory. So when you played things, you say, oh, that'll work with that, and that'll work with that, and then not ever be able to hear them in real life. You had to hear them in your head. So when we went to like a Foley playback on the Foley stage, or later when we could play it back in our own rooms, we were able to carry that mental image of what we had heard back to the cutting room and augment it and manipulate our material or change our material to fit. Oh, that's a great idea. Let's follow the flow on that. That is. I keep coming back. I know I'm like a broken record about the time issue. If you don't have the time to do all that, the refinement never comes. And that's, and interestingly enough, one of the things I think, you guys can tell me what you think, one of the reasons those films have a certain cohesiveness to them is because it wasn't really a formula. There was definitely a style card that we all worked from. It was never written out, but all, sort of a group think. And because we'd all worked together, I mean, Terry, we worked together, 25 years, Suhail, 30 years. Dan, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what first films you did were probably 30 years worth of material.
That's
So,
what I was saying before, the collaboration was amazing. There
all
was
working together.
unspoken dialogue between everybody, to know that each person was going to handle their area with the same kind of style. I worked with the same dialogue editors throughout. We worked with this, against the same Foley people that I would go to and say, look, you're going to top this production sound. And it was perfect. It was never a double hit because we worked together. But there was that kind of collaborative group thing that I'm not sure exists right now. And we're killed by the idea that people are in their own homes. You don't have the water cooler discussions going on. You can't discuss, how you're treating a certain sequence. The thread that ran through all Bruckheimer movies was we had one person that was in control, and that was George. He had his hands on everything. He almost knew the orchestration of the design, the sound design of the movie in his head. And he knew how to delegate that to the people that he trusted. And that was the entire crew that moved from one to the next to the next. We shared a lot of these movies together.
And it was great. I mean, I didn't have to worry about how or even ask how Terry was going to handle some P effect or something, or how Victoria was going to handle this, because I could hear in my head. I knew how they were going to do it after 20 years. I didn't, there so much unwritten, unspoken communication. And so what happened is at a certain point, we aren't communicating with each other directly, but we communicate with each other through the film. The film is our method of communication with each other, because it speaks to each of us, and we all know our how we react. We will react. So it's this wonderful cohesiveness that I have never experienced anyplace else in my professional career, except working with George and these guys, these fabulous guys.
That's incredible. Let's jump 1 year later. The following year, 1998. One of the biggest film releases of that year was Armageddon. And this is actually, we're in the 25th anniversary of that film this year.
Ay, ay, ay.
This
Make
is
me
another
feel old.
This is another Michael Bay film. I think this is his third film by this point. And there's obviously a lot of hype leading up to this movie. I've heard Michael Bay say in interviews that he actually oversaw all the visual effects for the film himself. I'm curious how this impacted your schedule and approach to covering all the action through this film, since there were so many visual effects.
That movie,
Constant flux. We were in constant change. I mean,
It was like triage.
you were.
It was like a giant triage.
Yeah, I mean, you were in constant change. It was like that was it. The mirror sequence, for example, just would change. I'd cut it, get it done, and it's all set to go and whatever, and then it'd be a whole new slew of changes that would come down, and we would end up fixing it, changing it and moving forward. It's one of those things where the visual effects as well as the practical effects, like the rovers and stuff like that, they did it at Disney on the soundstage, but then it all got visual effects were added to all of that. So it was tough, and then you had to deal with dialogue and all the dialogue futzing and all the dialogue squelching and everything else. And we had to time it out with everybody. Luckily, we were digital, so we would always take the edited sequence, and we would take that, put it into our effects units, and then we would match where everything gets so that it was right where it's supposed to be. And then that would change. So all of a sudden now the shots change. They're no longer being futzed. Now they're on camera, and it's and you'd constantly be making changes on these things.
Spend a lot of time chasing your tail.
Yeah, and they were really short sequences, and it would go from the two different locations where they were on the meteor, or it was when they were training. It would go to all the different things. It'd be underwater, it would be in the control room, it would be, and then it was crazy. But
well, that was Michael Bay's style at the time. Also, is getting those short, perfect, cool shots, and then moving on to the next little piece of story. That was great.
Equipment wise, we were on two different systems too. Effects was on Pro Tools, and dialogue was on Audio Vision. Right. And we were not yet in sync with all this kind of stuff. So, and I do remember, I think we had Fox, and there were six 6 or 7 assistants in a bullpen in order to deal with the amount of massive effects that were coming in. So it was chaotic and crazy. That one almost did us all in.
Yeah, that was. I can't tell you how many automobile accidents we had on that crew, on the crew on that show. I trashed my Beamer.
Oh my God. Well, I went to Gloria D'Alessandro, who was one of the effects editors, unfortunately passed away recently, and there was a memorial, and I showed some of the outtakes. I interviewed her for Making Waves, and then I asked her, I think, what was the craziest or whatever, and she said Armageddon, and there were all these sound editors, people there, and everybody burst out laughing. Who was it was like, oh yeah, I forgot that it was the craziest, but yeah, Gloria agreed with us.
Gloria was one of the dialogue editors on so many films.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, well, if I'm correct, that was one of the films where they ended up doing trailers over at the lot for during the mixing stage, the phase.
Oh, we had dubbing stages running in every studio in town. I mean, we had like 8 or 9 dubbing stages running at the same time. It was, I mean, and because George couldn't be everywhere at once, one of us would get shepherded out to run whatever dubbing stage had to be running. I would like be at some facility running between 2 dubbing stages. He was over at Sony running between 4 stages. It was, I mean, it was a dubbing nightmare, but you know, Kevin and Greg managed to get it all synthesized into a pretty fabulous sounding job. I do remember at one point somebody said, "This seems awfully loud," and so somebody whipped out a meter and went 115 dB.
Wow.
Well, we better pare that down.
I see a question in the chat. I see a question in the chat, and you know, how do we handle all of that? It's like, you know, one of the things that we all got good at, and you can, you know, Hudson was really good at doing this, was that we would set up everything in pre-dubs. So it was all laid out in pre-dub form. So if you had 2 or 3 editors, 4 editors, 5 editors working on a reel, everybody had an assignment to do, and that's what they ended up doing. And it worked really well because, you know, it's one person just couldn't cut the whole thing by themselves. There just wasn't enough time. And so logistically, that's how we ended up doing it, was the fact that we broke everything down into pre-dubs. We'd say, okay, Midge, you got pre-dub A, so Hale, you got pre-dub B, Hudson, you got pre-dub C, you know, and so forth and so forth. And we would just cut that particular pre-dub.
And while we had
and then meet at the end, you know, it's like, you know.
And while we had a lot of freedom and creativity within that structure, the actual mechanical structure of making the movie, the what went where, how it got from here to there, how it got dubbed, was all very, very regimented.
Yeah.
That we built a structure, a no-fail structure, because with deadlines and very rigorous rules of what and how things happened, because only if you had that structure to live in could you do the creative work required to make the thing come alive. Otherwise, you'd be chasing your tail all the time, and stuff would be getting dropped and lost. And particularly on films like that and Pearl Harbor, we started collaborating with Lucasfilm, with Skywalker. So they were doing part of the film up there, and we were doing part of the film down here, and it all had to arrive on schedule, on the dubbing stage, the right pre-dubs in the right order, on the right stage. We're running 8 stages. So there's a mechanical function to doing a Jerry Bruckheimer a film that is very regimented. But within inside that regiment gave us the creativity to try to explore and get what we got.
With that said, you know, when we're talking about working with other locations, with other pieces of equipment, somebody on film, somebody digitally, all of that kind of stuff, it created. There was also times on the dub stage where the material lived somewhere, and yet there wasn't enough time to find it, so they redid it on the stage. So they were acting, you know, people behind the mixers at times coming up with other sounds. It was crazy chaotic, but it was the only way to throw the kitchen sink at something in order to get it done.
Yeah,
No.
it becomes difficult because if you just throw the kitchen sink at it, like Terry said, what happens is you end up with a big crash with no definition. So the trick became to put all that stuff up forward, but to make sure that it was all really well articulated, really well focused, and really well chosen. Because if everybody just puts everything in and shows up, you get just a mess. And I think I'm fairly proud to say that our Bruckheimer films never sounded a mess.
Yeah.
Most of
the
the
other-
time.
It was
The other-
also like a leeway to the mix stage, you know, that the directors had their vision and their way of doing things and their manner of putting the film together. So there was like, not to change, but we did so many films together. In the Pirates movie, there was one Pirates movie where they spent 8 days on one reel. That can't happen now. They don't have that kind of time. They don't give people that kind of time. So we spent 8 days watching that Johnny Depp swing from one mountain to another over and over and over until you go crazy. I can't do that anymore. I've just got to step outside of the room. I can't handle it. But that was all process. You know, the directors had their hands in it. They knew about the deadlines. They did not want to let go of how much stuff that they wanted to put into the film and their vision of how that sound was going to be. So all of that time spent on a dub stage was sort of crafting, you know, the sound of each film. It was fascinating to watch. It blow your ears out, but it was fascinating to watch.
And it was also it was exhaustive. I mean, just the sheer decibel level for the sheer number of hours is just racks your body with exhaustion. I don't know how mixers can do it 52 weeks a year. I don't know how they physically can stand up to the decibel level, because at the end of the day, I would just go home totally exhausted, just ready to fall flat on my face. And it wasn't just because of the long hours. It was because of the sheer physical experience of having been pummeled with sound for 15 hours a day.
Whether they admit it or not, there's a lot of re-recording mixers that have professionally made earplugs that would cut out a portion of the sound that would damage their hearing.
Me too.
A lot of people. I mean, it was almost like a candy ball on the dub stage was a bowl of earplugs, because you had to have it if you're going to sit in there and watch them mix over and over and over.
Right
So-
next to it was a bottle of what we used to call dubbing candy. And it was Advil.
I had a question about one of the most iconic scenes, I think, for most audiences of this movie. The end of the movie comes as a bit of a surprise. There's this final video call between Bruce Willis and Liv Tyler, carrying a lot of dramatic weight. Terry, were there any unique challenges to bringing this video call scene to life?
Oh my God, yes. Yeah, the dialogue, it was a very emotional scene, and you had to hear every bit of it. All I remember is tears, crying, and making sure that played, that the emotion of the scene played. So, you were watching this thing fall apart. He was going to explode any minute. And, she was having this father-daughter dialogue. Yes, it was a big challenge.
And
I remember one of the
tough thing.
challenges was, just being a sound editor, and we'd literally have spotting sessions and we'd all watch the film together. That might be the last movie that we all watched. I don't know that we actually had a spotting session, and we sat and watched a movie. Then I said, "Oh no, I cannot believe I'm going to cry in front of all these guys." And I did not even stupider movies that were like, it was like, oh no, it's like,
That's all the rest of us were crying too. It was
I
okay.
was like, we're like, and you're sitting there with all these guys. It's like, Jesus.
It's hard to do
Yeah, that was
something.
it. Oh, but I had I had that last reel, and that the part where it's all, the meteor is shaking and everything. And it was so fake, like, do you remember that? It was so like rubbery and stuff. You really had to make it sound like it was all rocks and everything. And it was like, it was hard to, I think the sound helped. So that
Yeah,
you
if you
didn't
take
go
away
in.
if you take away the sound of a lot of those Bruckheimer films and you watch it without the effects, some of it's pretty marginal stuff. But I remember hearing the story. I went to work for George because I had seen Top Gun, I saw it at the National, 70 millimeter, when that was a big damn deal. And I'd seen it like 3 times and said, this is so, I've never seen anything like this. I've got to go work for this guy. So I hook and by crook got myself a job working for him about a year later, and managed to keep it for 22 years. But when they had a preview from you worked on that film, right, Terry?
Top Gun, yeah, absolutely.
The preview bombed, right? Because it did not have a final soundtrack on it, or the soundtrack on it. It had terrible troubles because the sound was not there, right?
I don't think the studio at the time was sure about what it was going to be. I mean, what it became was something else. But the interesting thing about working on Top Gun is they could change all the dialogue with the masks on in the cockpit. A lot of that was ADR because they were changing so that we would understand the visual of what we were seeing. And I know that the second, talking to people that did the second Top Gun, it was like they had to live up to the first one. I mean, they actually, in the interview for the upcoming Bake Off, they were told it was like a bullet hitting a bullet. You had to match Top Gun 2 with Top Gun 1. So it was cool. It was wonderful working on that, but that also, it was all film. And we were on the entire floor at Paramount doing that picture.
I just remember hearing it and saying, this is like totally different from any movie I have ever heard before. And I think in very many ways, it changed the sound that came from all movies in the following 30 years. And you can lay a lot of that blame on the soundtrack, not just because those. If you take away the sound effects from that movie, some of that stuff looks pretty lame. But you put that big throbbing soundtrack in it, and it suddenly comes alive.
It was the first Tony Scott movie that I had done, and like from that point on, his movies were something special. There was something about it that drove the action of the movie, and that was the most special part of working on Top Gun. Was Tony.
And he was such a lovely, talented man too.
They even did a demo one year at the Oscars when they were introducing the sound category, and I believe they used Top Gun as an example. They played it without the sound, and then they played it with the sound for the audience. And I think that it was shocking to everybody what the contribution that sound makes to the film industry.
So not a recording that George and Cece did too, where yeah.
It's also I think of all the films we worked together, I'm going to go on a little bit of a limb, but not too far, and say that probably our favorite ones were the Tony Scott ones, because in the end he was a filmmaker's filmmaker. I mean, it was really an art form for him. People say are just blown away by his visuals, but it was so much more than his visuals. I've never seen a director before or since who cared about every detail of the film, whether it was a line of dialogue, whether it was a sound effect, whether it was a music cue, whether it was a visual effect, whether it was color, whether it was an angle, whether it was a performance. All of those elements were equally important to him, and he put the same amount of energy into every aspect of the film. And that kind of is contagious, and it runs through your entire crew if you were working on a Tony Scott film. So we would he did 4 or 5 Bruckheimer films, and
remember, and we Man on Fire and Spies.
Man on Fire, yeah.
No, I can't because we did Tony's films outside of Jerry Bruckheimer too, so I can't remember which ones are which. But whenever we said we're going to get to. We get the notice that we were going to do a Tony Scott film, and it was like, wow, yay! We get to do a real movie, because if you look at those films, they have a certain flash and panache, but they're always the stories about people too, actors and stories about somebody doing something and changing in their lives. And well, the other Bruckheimer ones are always fun, big entertainments. Tony's always had a certain heart and performance level too.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I want to jump ahead just quickly about 5 years in time. and ask a few questions about a little movie called Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl. Then I do want to get to a few audience questions. If anyone here has questions, please type them in the chat and we'll try to get a few of those in as well. So we're back in summer of 2003. The first Pirates movie comes out, which means this is the 20th anniversary now of the film that we're in. I think this movie caught a lot of people by surprise with how incredible it was. Hardly anyone was expecting a movie based on a Disney ride to be that well written, funny, and entertaining at every single turn. And a big story component of that is that the crew of the Black Pearl are actually already dead. And we see that they're skeletons when the moonlight hits them in the film. I was curious what went into creating the movement sounds of these skeletons.
Well, it was interesting. We had collected over years a giant bin of bones. For different projects we had done. I think with 13th Warrior was one of them, when these guys get stuck in a cave and they're walking through bones. So we had quite a good supply of bones. And what I did was I tied a bunch of them together so that I could dangle them like that you would have a skeleton in like somebody's medical class or something like that. And it sounded really good. And so you would walk Barbosa up and pick up the bottle, and then all of a sudden he would start to drink, and we would go to the bones, and the bones, we would rattle them and we could crunch them together. There were a lot of cool things we could do in the Pirates of the Caribbean, like the little barnacles on the sailors and stuff like that. We could add I took little pine cones and stuff like that to make crackly sounds for the barnacles growing out of their skin. All those things were kind of a real fun thing for Foley for us. As well as, the standard running around the Black Pearl and sword fighting and all the gear and that kind of stuff.
It was some of the greatest layering of sounds, because you had the Foley, the detail of the Foley, and then you had some of the production that was recorded, the pirates that were going, the creaking that they had, the water that they had. And the big trick there was building beds for what was happening, and you could literally carry some of that stuff from Pirates 1 to 2 to 3 because it was all in the same world, and it was massive amount of work.
Yeah,
We still have
we still have props and things like that. I have like actually I brought it home with me, the little earring that we use for Jack Sparrow's earring sound, that we put it together and it's part of his character. Every time his head turns, you hear his earring move, and we put it together. We put it together. Sorry, Terry.
No, it wasn't yours. It was yours afterwards. It was just perfect. It was a shot on the set that killed me. Yeah.
We put it together during the first Curse of the Black Pearl. And I at the end of it, I thought, because we would George would have us do a earring pass through the whole reel. So he would be flying up in the air, spinning around and running up and down stairs, and you'd always hear his earring. So I put a paper clip on it and thought, just in case they make another Pirates of the Caribbean, I better keep this. And 5 of them later, I'm still running his earring around and up and down. And it's one of those kind of like iconic props for us. We still have all the props that we gathered for the first one, all the chains and all the shackles and the guns and all that kind of stuff. And it's great because we can use, they make a second one, they make a third one, we add new stuff to it. And the surface that we use for the Black Pearl is it's like, and once again, to me, it's an iconic sound as a Foley artist. And thank God we found it. It was just kind of like a giant piece of wood that somebody had leaned up against our building to get rid of it. And I went out and I looked at it and I went, let's bring it inside and walk on it, see what happens. And lo and behold. So that movie was full of that kind of fun stuff.
Once in that first film, once we see that they are skeletons, there are also several instances of them actually talking on screen. But obviously without any lips or facial structure that we're used to seeing when humans speak. So Terry, what sorts of challenges did you face with lip sync and making the dialogue work with visual effects in this film?
The challenges I had more with that was under clarity of the dialogue, the understanding. And when Johnny Depp went off on his pieces, you had to make sure that, you know, what he was saying was clear. And like I was saying earlier, building a bed of the pirate activity behind all of it, or handling whatever those locations were. Those were some of the challenges, you know, creating that kind of authenticity. We had and I don't remember the character's name, but the woman in, maybe it was 3, her accent was difficult to understand, very difficult to understand. There was a lot of ADR because of that. But you know, a lot of group ADR in those films. Changes again, we had to deal with massive number of changes throughout. That was one of the ones we were at Disney doing those movies. And again, I had a staff of people, you know, quite a staff of people cutting dialogue, but we don't have that kind of luxury now. You know, now it's basically one person does all of it.
And Terry, you were saying there was a lot of ADR, and that's true. In fact, all of Jerry's movies have a lot of ADR. He is a guy who's not afraid of ADR. It's more important for him to get the performance and to hear it than where it comes from. If it comes from dialogue, that's great. If it comes from loops, that's great. He wants you to be able to hear and understand the performance.
Right. And that's why I was saying, you know, so the clarity was very important, and it was really good that Juno and I could work together, you know, on things, not necessarily pirates, but a lot of times in Jerry's movies in general, you know, he would get it for protection, but we would use part of it just to get the clarity of the line. And he was open to that as long as you understood it. He didn't care.
And we also can't overlook the fact that by and large, Jerry hired great production recordists.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the best. I mean, with Lee Orloff,
Yeah.
Devlin, Peter Devlin on Gone in 60 Seconds. My God, he did an incredible job on that. So,
yeah. So we do the effects and the dialogue and the editorial stuff. The production recordists is so important, and the re-recording folks are so important. Most of them were done by Greg Russell and Kevin O'Connell, and certainly not by Chris Boyce. And those people take our vision and turn it into a reality. So and plus we also can't leave out the music editors, who are so much part of a Jerry Bruckheimer sound. Jerry's pictures are big actors, big action, big music, big effects, big VFX. I mean, those are sort of like his trademarks. I mean, his stars are, he always has stars, but they aren't mega movie stars usually. It's being handled by good, competent actors and solid stars. Nick Cage is a solid star, but what he was selling was the Jerry Bruckheimer movie versus the Nick Cage movie.
And I talking about music and stars, I remember a person I will not name, a big composer. Jerry felt like he phoned in the score, and we were, in the middle of mixing and whatever, and he had to redo the whole score, and it was like, that was Jerry saying, no way, this is not good enough. Do you guys remember that? That was crazy.
Not specifically, but I do remember on National Treasure, was it 1 or 2, Terry, that we were at the end of the movie, and there was this music cue in the last reel that nobody could figure out. The music editors were there all night. And we'd been up and down on the dub stage 5 times. Nobody could make it work. And we finally patched together something that was pretty good. And to play it back for Jerry, he comes in at 7 o'clock and says, why don't you just do this, this, and this? And the music editor went, okay, da 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 da. And my God, it changed the whole picture. It worked perfectly. I mean, the guy, you think producer, what does he know? The guy knows about filmmaking. He knows about the visual. He knows about the sound. He knows about the music.
It's incredible. I'd love to get to a few audience questions. Mark Lanza asks, how authentic were the cars in Bad Boys? They sounded great. And I guess how did you go about
one or two?
Let's start with one. Yeah, the first
one we didn't do.
We didn't do one.
Okay, then let's go to 2.
It was a trick question. The answer is all the recordings for Bad Boys 2 were new recordings.
Yeah.
I think John Basal did them all.
Yeah, and we cut those cars from the ground up, and I know R.J. Palmer was one of the guys that did the heavy load on the cars, and but yeah, we cut everything from the ground up. We had one of the yellow H2 Hummers. It was pre-release of the car. Took it out in the desert, Agua Dulce, out there. Beat the living bejesus out of it. The tires came off the wheels, all kinds of hell. Had to flap the thing on a flat to get it back to the studio. Just beat the living hell out of it. And it's okay. By the time the film was finished, those 6 brand new H2 Hummers that I used for the movie all went to the crusher.
Yeah.
Destroyed.
Gone in 67, so Gone in 60 Seconds had more of a challenge with cars, didn't it?
Yeah, well, those are all original recordings too. I mean, I talked about the budget for this stuff. It's not cheap to go out and record that stuff, but we had weeks and weeks of time to do that because
they recorded Eleanor, and then we sweetened Eleanor with our library sounds of the Mustang, primarily because George is the thing with George.
Yeah, he has a Mustang. Yeah.
He's a car
fanatic. He's a car guy too.
Yeah, he's a car guy. He's a total car geek and car fanatic. So, but we ended up sweetening Eleanor quite a bit, and which really made it really hum really well. And then between the combination of Foley and sound effects, man, we literally crushed it on how those things.
And we also put them on what's the stand? I've forgotten what it's called. The stand. You can put the car on that rolls on wheeler. The wheels roll on a stand, so it operates and revs while standing still.
Yeah.
And the wheels turn on big stainless steel turns. So we recorded it on, I forgot what the machine is called. But also we spent a lot of time adding organics to that stuff too. I mean, there are all kinds of animals and mechanical sounds that are in there. In fact, Jerry's films and George's style a lot relies on a lot of organic sound, things that we did a certain amount of synth stuff, but it was always secondary to a really organic, natural sound. The reason we use things like leopard growls, slow down, and things, and the goal, of course, I quite often hear them and you go, oh, that's a leopard growl. And if you listen to those films, we very carefully try to get all that sound blended into the sound you can't hear what it really is. But the reason we do that is because people have a natural biological fear of those kind of things. So if you hear a leopard growl from 2 million years of evolution, your body naturally reacts to this physical reaction to this growling sound. So when we're putting these kind of organic sounds into the cars, we are making them frightful to the audience. We're eliciting primal emotional responses, and it wasn't accidental. It was planned and designed into the original style and design of the movie. So that's the answer. That's the answer to the cars.
Yeah, yeah, and Greg Russell did a great job, mixing a lot of the stuff. So
oh yeah,
he really put a great deal of effort into it, and it came out sounding great. And Greg Orloff also was the other one that was mixing effects for us a lot, and he did the same thing. It was just beautiful. Came
The
out-
reason, part of the reason that opening of Bad Boys 2 works so well is that all that car stuff is not, like I mentioned earlier, it's not miniatures, it's not VFX, it's all live action recordings. The city of Miami was pretty upset because they shot that thing on, with all the cars falling off, on a brand new causeway they hadn't even opened to the public, and they dropped these cars off of all these car carriers and smashed the living hell out of the road. Huge bills to repair this brand new road they had just built. But the reason it's exciting, it's really viscerally exciting because you're seeing the real thing.
Oh, by the way, I was going to undergrad at the University of Miami at the time when that movie came out, so I was right nearby with it.
No.
Wow.
Question from Chris Shank. Do you feel that movie halls fail to replicate the similar output regardless of having a Dolby Atmos configuration? Any suggestions on how to bridge the gap between studio quality and movie hall sound quality? And I think he's speaking to international movie theaters such as in India.
It's a difficult problem. It's so much of we dub to one standard in Hollywood. All our sound stage, our dub stages are set up exactly the same, pretty much exactly the same way, and have very similar sounds. I mean, each one has slight characteristic differences, and we all kind of aim at the Motion Picture Academy's Goldwyn Theater as our reference. And quite often we'll take a reel and we'll play it in that theater to see what it's going to sound like in a reference theater. But it's difficult. It's a commercial business run mostly, at least in the United States and Europe, by big cinema chains, and it's a cost issue with them. I mean, how much money is AMC going to spend on the sound of any individual auditorium? Some of the big rooms, they spend a lot. I'm sure they do not spend nearly as much on the smaller ones. And I'm sure as pictures roll out across the world, they're going to sound different. And there's not much Hollywood or filmmakers can do about that.
Yeah, that's totally fair. We have a great question from Itab. How do you deal with the current lower budgets and still maintaining high budget quality? You all kind of referenced that in terms of the amount of time that you'd get nowadays on a film compared to in years past, but just, yeah, I guess curious how you deal with that on projects nowadays.
Well,
think
for me, as far as
physically-
Foley goes, we it's one of our goals in our company is to always do the exact same thing, give the exact same quality no matter what the budget is. So the problem is that sometimes we're just kind of we're eating a little bit of the budget ourselves to get the job done the way it should be. Seldom do every once in a while a picture comes along that actually has a budget that you go, okay, that's doable. But it's really hard, and you don't want to cut any corners. All you want to do is spend, what we end up doing is just spending more time to make it right. And that's all we can do at this point until the budgets change. I'm ever hopeful that something will happen where the budgets will start to blossom again to where they once were, but I doubt they'll come back to the Rock and Armageddon size for quite a while.
I think
But
those
that's-
days are gone.
yeah.
Those days are gone.
Yeah, definitely.
Also,
definitely.
I think
Anyway.
also what we always, even when we were finishing up the Bruckheimer, the budgets were starting to, the screws, you could feel the screws coming down on us.
Yeah.
Toward the end of that big run. But what one of the things we did was we tried to never reduce the quality or the detail of the work. What would happen is there would be less choices. You got more decisions made by us, and you got less options. You sort of took it or leave it. If we have to go back and redo it because you don't like one of our choices, then we'll do that. But we can't give you 3 choices anymore. We can give you 1 choice. We can't give you 8 layers of sound. We'll give you 6 layers of sound. So the effect is a little different, but I think we always tried to maintain the overall quality of what we did. Sometimes if you're trying to work on a VW budget and they want a Rolls-Royce sound, you try to give them a good Mercedes, but not but not charge the but they won't be paying more than the VW.
We have a question from Greg. Roughly how much of location dialogue is used compared to ADR, and has this changed over time?
I personally like to use as much production dialogue as possible. I think with the new technology, we have more opportunities to do that because there are ways of cleaning up dialogue. On every film, even every film that was a Bruckheimer film, every effort was made to use as much production as possible. You know, certain circumstances, it was difficult. One particular thing that you should know is sometimes the directors, they'll allow you to ADR, but in the long run, they're used to hearing the production track with all the noise and all the garbage sometimes as they get. There was a scene in Pearl Harbor that was a prime example, and we used the production, and that was in Hawaii. It was more important for Michael Bay to get the curtains blowing, so there was a fan, and getting that fan out, we used all the production dialogue. It was an early morning in Hawaii, curtains blowing, nurses talking.
Mm-hmm.
They used all the production. It's a challenge sometimes. It's part of the creative thing that I love about cutting dialogue is finding where the bodies are buried. I read the notes that the production mixers write to find out what was happening on the set and where I could find, an alternate word, an alternate syllable, an alternate anything to make something work. Or then, like I was saying before, if you work, in sync with ADR editors or ADR supervisors, or you are an ADR supervisor with a dialogue, you know how to mix and mingle and use a little of this and a little of that, and you don't know. And that's the important thing. Going forward, before, on film, on digital, same world we live in, trying to keep as much production as possible, because that's where the actors' performances are the best. So it's really hard to, ask about Armageddon in the last scene, really hard to recreate an emotional scene, reshoot it, and get that same impact. So
we also shouldn't neglect to pay tribute to where it's due is on the group is Barbara Harris and her operation provided such wonderful material, and we had big group budgets with time to get large groups and very specific actors to provide beautiful group material that's not always available on smaller budget shows.
Yeah.
Wow. Just a couple more questions. We have one from Adam Parrish King, who I think you'll know Vidge from years past at USC. Adam says, such a fascinating discussion. It seems to me this career in sound is just about ideal for creative humans, except the lack of sleep and work-life balance. That sounds like an age-old problem from the stories you've told. Do you guys see any possibility that could be resolved in the future?
No.
It's a sacrifice. You make a sacrifice.
Yeah,
It is
you
what
make
it
a
is.
sacrifice. I mean, that's just part of the filmmaking process, whether you're working production or whether you're working in post. It's an artistic business as well as a business itself. And no, I don't think it's gonna. You'll never have a 9 to
It's
5.
it's the pull between the front office and what we do. We live in different worlds. We have to accommodate each other to a certain degree, but in the end, they hold the purse strings and they pull our strings.
One would hope that you have a personal challenge to, take the break between films. The idea is you commit to a certain amount of time. You know that your life is not in your own hands at that particular time, but make sure that you make the balance happen. Take the time off in between. One to another will eat its way into your life.
I tried never to work more than 40 weeks a year, because trying to, especially doing these Bruckheimer films, if you went back to back, we had to do back to back a few times, and it was
Grueling.
miserable. So I usually tried to take a month or two off between these monsters. But I usually started very early on the film and went really late. So it was hard sometimes to do that.
But I'm just looking at, now I've been teaching long enough that how many generations have I taught? I feel like, Adam, that things are going to change. I can just see it. And I think the world is changing after COVID. I really do. I think that, I mean, because I was like a real hard ass with my students, and I still am, and they give me a hard time, my evals, but it's like, but I say the most important thing I teach is show up on time, do what you say you're going to do, make your deadlines. And so, be a good collaborator. When you finish your work, ask somebody else for, if you can, that you can help, and you're going to get work doing that. But I also see that students, younger people, and they're going to be the ones who are going to be the producers and things. And I really think that there's going to be more of a work-life balance, more of thinking about mental health. Mental health is a huge thing after COVID. Emotional, mental issues. There's a lot more that I see, coming up with students and things, and we have to deal with it. And I think that the way that we were all working, I really believe it is going to change. I think the world is going to change. We were all hoping that it could have so easily, when things got easy, things got like, I mean, a lot of things are so much easier once we went to digital, and we could do so much more ourselves, and it was really great. But then the producers figured it out right away, and it went down to tiny crews and shorter thing. And the reels went from 10-minute reels to 20-minute reels. And, and now it's like with episodics, like they're in an hour. So it didn't get any better, but I feel that there's a change coming, and it might take a while, but I do.
Well, it's also
hours
kind
that
of
we
hard.
put in. If you look at the grueling hours we put in, you really lose a certain amount of creativity after a certain number of hours.
Yeah.
So if we had analyzed, or they had analyzed, pushing on a deadline, and you're working like crazy, at 2:00 in the morning, you've lost your insight into what you're doing. So I think that balance is coming. That balance has happened. And that maybe is because of the digital world, because they can see things more at a fingertip glance. They don't have the kind of budget, so we don't work those kind of hours. So we don't run ourselves into the ground on purpose. So there's still a lot to be said there too.
Were you going to add something, Dan, before?
Well, I was just going to say that, one of the hard parts of that is that, you tend to, if you're working on something, you're trying to figure out what something is going to sound like, or, what type of, what you're going to use for a certain scene, things like that. Sometimes you can't always just like shut the light off and walk away. Sometimes I find myself at home going through things, going, okay, wait, this might work. So we do tend to, because of the creative process, we do tend to take it home with us a little bit anyway.
Or a lot.
What's that?
Or a lot.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah. My wife always used to say to me, okay, this is the deal. When you get in your car, take this hat off and put that hat on. Because when you're at home, I want you to be chatting with me, not thinking about what,
And also,
it is going to sound like.
and in Hollywood, at least, it's a union town. The union's your friend. They've got the reason those rules exist. The rules are to protect you. So as vice president of IA 700, the Editors Guild, I admonish you all, follow those rules. They're there to protect your butt.
That's true. My
And
wife would agree. Yeah.
off of soapbox.
It's a helpful perspective to have here. Final question from Tony. How do you guys feel about the many DAWs out there? Obviously, Pro Tools is standard, but is it a hassle when working with a crew who work in a different DAW? Does that ever happen for you all?
Only work.
yeah.
I only work in Pro
When we
Tools.
first got started in the digital world, we had, a dozen different DAWs, and it would drive you crazy. You'd do a job on one project, and you'd be on this system. You'd go to another one, you'd be on that system, and it would drive you absolutely crazy to keep up with all the different different systems. Although they all had similarities in a lot of ways, it would still drive you crazy. I know, but then when Pro Tools came along, I personally knew that this was going to be the system that was going to be the Moviola of the digital age, because it can do everything. It can edit music, it can edit dialogue, it can edit effects, you can record in it, you can mix into it. So it's like it offered all those things regarding that.
And that's one of the reasons we were our crew was so late to getting to digital behind everybody else, because we weren't fully in till about 1998. And the reason we were slow is because we wouldn't do it until we had a digital picture. Because all this stuff of slewing tape back and forth was just garbage. And George was really good at holding the lines and telling the studio, we won't do it until you get a digital picture. And that's when we made the change. Now in Hollywood, there isn't really any system except Pro Tools. So it doesn't really affect us much.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
we did Red Corner, and we were on the I believe the audio vision.
Right.
Yeah, we were on the audio vision. We cut effects as well as dialogue on that system, and Foley. But that was the only system that actually had a digital picture. When we did, most of our crew worked on Eaters of the Dead or the 13th Warrior, and part of that. In the beginning, we were actually on videotape.
It was awful.
And we were chasing videotape, and we were like, what the fuck is this nonsense? Give me back a black and white dupe, it'll be more accurate.
You sort of
And then
put that into place and
they
play
bought
it
us,
back.
and then they bought us digital cards, picture cards, where all of a sudden now the picture had to be digitized and imported and all this kind of cool stuff. And let me tell you that there was a big difference in sync and in how things were and all that kind of stuff. So I was very happy when, they finally locked us down and we actually had a digital picture to work with and everything else. And
Yeah, but Pro Tools is pretty much the only thing in Hollywood. So we don't really have, beyond that, we don't really have much opinion probably.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Close out with a question I can answer. Does the MPSC plan on more group discussions like this with people who worked with the recipient of the Golden Reel Filmmaker Award each year? Yes, we're definitely hoping to do this in years to come. So if you all are interested, we'll continue this next year with next year's award winner. I just wanted to thank you all so much for your time, Terry, Dan, Midge, Suhail, and Hudson. This has been so informative. I've learned a lot, and your work really speaks for itself and help inspire so many of us coming up in this industry. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
very
Pleasure.
welcome. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's great to see all you guys. Nice. Great to learn on my end too.
Yeah, Dan, you and Terry, both of you need to come down and like I said before, come to school. We'd love to have you at school. Really would.
It would probably be it'd probably be a fun idea. I've toyed with it, and I would love to see the facility for sure.
I'm
Great.
going to send you my email, my school email, and then please send me a note when you're ready.
Okay, great.
And let me.
Yeah.
I gotta type. It's just I can't type more than that.
Nice.
To everyone else who's here, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate you coming to this MPSC Sound Advice event and hope to see you at next month's Golden Reel Awards and at future Sound Advice events. Thank you for coming.